If you regularly watch the news, and if you see the developments in politics all over the world maybe, if you see viruses spreading and the fear for pandemics, if you see the forest burnings in Australia, forest fires, and the general concern about climate change, maybe there are other topics too, but you might think, well, this ancient idea of the apocalypse, this idea of the end of the world, it may not be so weird. Maybe the end of the world is not even far. What would happen if you would say this and scholar of religion Seth Bledsoe would be near? Well, I think he might say something like, well, you've got a point, but you know, if you look at the original meaning of the word apocalypse, then you will see that the difference, well, the meaning is somewhat different. Apocalypse originally meant something like a secret knowledge about how the world works and about how the world will end. And this knowledge is known to only a few people. And of course, yes, then too, the end of the world, of course, it was violent and it was going to be chaotic, just like we imagine it now. But there's another big difference, and that is that in the original interpretation, the end of the world was not actually going to be the end of the world. Rather, it would be the start, the beginning of a new world. So, if we look at our ideas or imaginations of the apocalypse and the post-apocalypse now, is there anything we can learn from these ancient, these original interpretations of the apocalypse? For example, if we look at films and video games, how is the end of the world portrayed there? And how does it differ from the way we looked at it, people looked at it centuries ago? I'm very happy that he will tell us all about it tonight, scholar of religion Seth Bledsoe. He is affiliated to Radboud University, and he studies ancient Jewish and Christian literature with a particular interest in the relationship between violence and religion, and of course, the apocalypse. Seth will give a lecture of about 40 minutes, after which he will be interviewed, and I won't do this alone tonight. I've asked my colleague, Chida Temples, who's also a program manager at Radboud Reflects, to join me because I know a little bit about theology, he knows a lot about video games, so we thought we'd be a great team. So there'll be the lecture, there'll be the interview, and of course there will also be ample time for your own questions. Thank you for coming. It's really nice to see all of you here tonight on such a doomy topic. I hope you'll have a very interesting evening, and I'm happy to give the floor to Seth Bledsoe.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for having me here tonight. I'm excited to talk to you about, as Elizabeth said, very happy subject. You have to admit, things are getting worse. You have to admit, things are getting worse. These words were told to me about 1.5 years ago by a friend of mine when I was back in the United States visiting. We were talking about politics in the United States in particular. And well, for him, his party was in charge and it still is. And yet, he had this view that things were getting worse. Now, he didn't mean some of the stuff that Elizabeth brought up. Climate change, no. Threat of war, maybe. Global inequality, not so much. Resurgence of nationalism, definitely not. Probably was part of that. No, what he meant was an entirely different thing. We might call moral decay, cultural decline. A longing for the good old days where things went well and everything was in order and there was no really reason to complain for him when Christianity was in charge. Today it's not, right? Secularism and all sorts of social issues that I won't go through today. He saw this as a threat, and therefore, despite the fact of his privilege, living in the United States, moderately wealthy at the time, and still political power in charge, had lots of opportunities. For him, things were much, much worse, and are going to continue to be so. Much worse than they were before. Despite if I brought up some issues, say as slavery, yes, still exists today, definitely a problem, but on a much less scale than even a couple hundred years ago. Wealth disparity, I've mentioned. Maybe it is getting worse. Maybe he has a point. But many, many more people today have access to wealth and health care, among other things, than they did even a century ago. Racism, ethno-nationalism, yes, still prevalent, of course. But again, to most of us, nothing to the scale that it was prevalent even 80 years ago in the previous century. So why, from his perspective, are things getting worse? Why do him and others have this persistent negative outlook about the world? And this led me to thinking about this notion of apocalypse as not just an ancient problem, and not just a modern one when we think about the threat of nuclear war or ecological crises, that it's a problem that's very much recent for lots of people out there, coming from a particular perspective. And what I want to focus on today in my lecture is why he thinks the way he does and why others have thought the way they think. Kind of self-explanatory there. We could spend all night, we could spend days really, even going through apocalyptic visions and specific scenarios. But my focus is on something that Elizabeth brought up. It's about apocalypse and picking up on the word itself and this idea of knowledge. And when we talk about the apocalypse, we're talking about a different worldview, a different way of seeing and interpreting global events, social change, really everything. Again, I'm not offering a complete overview of what we're doing, but what I've titled this lecture tonight as the Apocalyptic Imagination is a way of trying to understand what it means to think differently, where this sort of special knowledge comes from, and also looking forward to the interview and the question and answer about how this special knowledge and the symbols and codes that go with it still inform pop culture today, what we might call secular culture today, and not just those that are operating still under a theological worldview. Our goal then is to understand what I say as the function and fascination of the apocalypse. Now, you might think, if we're talking about the apocalypse, we should start by talking about, well, the end of the world. Oh, well, okay. For me, when it comes to imagining the apocalypse, it's not about the end of the world, as we see here, but about the beginning, creation. Because the knowledge then that's revealed is not just about what's going to happen, but about what is happening and what has happened. If we look back, and this is a quote here from the book of Genesis that describes the creation of the world and sets the stage for several apocalyptic motifs. One, if we think of creation, before I come to the quote, we can think of this idea of when the world was created, it was created according to a pattern, creating to a divine pattern. And apocalypse has to do with this revealing of the divine pattern. But again, it is a divine one. How are we supposed to know? And in fact, we're not supposed to know. So for those of you that may know the story of the Garden of Eden, the reason why Adam and Eve were kicked out is because they knew something they weren't supposed to know. To be more specific, they were told they could eat from any tree in this garden, any fruit. In particular, there's one special tree that they could eat from. It was called the tree of life. As long as they keep eating from that, they could live forever, presumably. But there was one tree they weren't allowed to, and that's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God tells the humans, don't eat from this or you'll die. Of course, many of us know the story. And there's a serpent and it tricks them and then they eat and eventually they're kicked out. But what some people fail to question, or maybe don't think to question, is why did God forbid that tree? Why limit knowledge? Well, it offers an explanation, one that maybe we don't think of. This is chapter 3. I forget the verse number at the moment. Should have put it up there. Then the Lord God said, "See, the human has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." So the Lord God sent him from the Garden of Eden. What this tells us is that for humans, we are supposed to have limited knowledge. Because what it means to be divine is to live forever and know everything. So really what we have here, and this is a foundational text for all later apocalyptic literature in early Christianity and Judaism, is really, yes, a reflection on theology, thus on who God is and what it means to be a God, but also on what does it mean to be human. And what it means to be human is to be limited, to be deficient, to be an outsider, but an outsider to a particular kind of knowledge. And when we talk about this knowledge, or rather epistemology, and what I mean by that is that not just that we know things, but how we know it and what kind of knowledge we have. When we talk about these things, that leads us to, okay, what is apocalypse? It's a revealing of that hidden knowledge. Not so dramatic, I guess. No, necessarily into the world. But apocalypse, in the term itself, was an occasion where someone, a particular someone, or a select group of people, were allowed access to this hidden knowledge, this divine knowledge that was forbidden way back then to Adam and Eve. What this visionary is allowed to do is to look beyond the veil, as this illustration shows. And what it reveals then is that things are not exactly the way they seem. It takes, in order to look past this veil, it takes something dramatic, though. Here it seems kind of simple. There's like sort of a shield there. But it often comes in the form of visions or dreams, otherworldly journeys. But what they see then is something that is totally incomprehensible because it is divine. It's hard to sort of think about it. There's that sort of logical idea that you can't unknow something. But if I say, imagine trying to describe what an elephant is to someone that's never seen of or heard of an elephant, right? Or it's a difficult thing to try to think about, a sort of difficult process. But as we look at a couple examples from the apocalypses, as we'll do in a minute, we see sort of what they mean. Are these fantastic images of this otherworldly kind of knowledge, and they have no idea how to describe it. So what we need then in an apocalypse is a code or a key to interpret this knowledge. And one of the key codes or assumptions that lies behind this is not only how we access it by this sort of vision, but also that we find out that how the logic of this knowledge, and it's what's happening in this hidden world, what we call the divine world or the heavenly world, is a mirror of what's happening on the earthly plane. And that heavenly world not only is the real world, is the reality of how and why things work, but it is what is first. There's an assumption that in the sort of the study of religion that we tend to think that humans understand this world and then they project onto the heavenly world what they see in this world. But the epistemology that we find in apocalypses is the entire other way around. It assumes that the real knowledge is there and that it informs what happens here. So this leads me to what I call the first function of the apocalypse, Okay, what is this knowledge doing? Okay, now that we understand that there's this secret knowledge, a hidden knowledge, has something to do with how the world's created, how it works, the way it works, its rhythm. As we can see these quotes, I won't read, with the idea that the heavens operate according to a pattern, and so also the earth. First and foremost, this kind of knowledge is a cosmic knowledge. It argues that the world operates according to this plan. Now that may seem so not so simple, but consider how we operate in the world today with plagues and chaos. The world is a messy place, right? If it operates according to a plan, then what's going on? Why is there so much chaos and evil and suffering in the world? So the first function of an apocalypse is explanation, is to explain and account for the vagaries of life, for the chaos. In other words, an apocalypse, at least in the ancient setting, is a theodicy. A theodicy is an explanation for why there's evil and suffering. If God is in charge, and if God is good, then why is the world so messed up? That's my simple way of explaining theodicy. Why is there suffering and evil if God is in charge and God is good? Now, some answers say, okay, well, humans, we're imperfect, right? And that's fine, and that's part of the story, but to focus only on human behavior as an explanation is problematic. One, it's too limited. Again, this is from an apocalypticist point of view. It's too limited. The world is bigger than individual human deeds. And secondly, it implies that humanity and humanity's behavior is what affects the cosmos, when, as I just said, it should be the other way around. And thus, to say that would be an affront to the sovereignty of God. What an apocalypse does is it offers an explanation for the chaos, and it assures that there is a logic. But the key to that logic is hidden behind the veil in the heavenly world. So what we find then in the earth, yes, it is a reflection of the divine, but it's an imperfect one, an imperfect reflection. So let's dive in a little bit to this logic of the apocalypse. And I've boiled it down to sort of 5 themes of what it means to think apocalyptically in the ancient world. Some of this I sort of have said, and now I've arranged it into a nice, neat column there with 5 things. First is pronounced dualism. What I mean by this is that there's good and evil. That's not so dramatic. Lots of people think there's good and there's bad, and that's great, but pronounced dualism is that there's only good and only bad. It's this mentality of you're with us or against us, and there's nothing in between. Now, there's possibilities to switch sides, so to speak, but that's an extreme way of thinking. I'll bring that up later in terms of what it means to think that the other side is evil, and absolutely so. There's no moral gray area. Second is cosmic scope. Probably not surprising for this one, is the idea that an apocalypticist thinks that everything that's happening has massive implications for the entire world. There's nothing local. Or if it is local, it's also part of a much grander design. Third is historical decay, with that quote that I began with. And here's where the explanatory part comes in, is that it says, okay, why are things getting worse? Why are the people of God suffering while the evil empires are ruling? Well, it's because it's supposed to. The world is supposed to get worse. Historical decay, things are supposed to get worse. And it says, okay, why does God not help us out from time to time? Well, God does, but only in dramatic ways. And ultimately, God will intervene in a big way. So yes, while you might question, why isn't God helping us out right now? Don't worry, again, it's part of this divine cosmic plan, but God will intervene eventually in a big way, usually in some form of a final battle between good and evil. And then lastly, it doesn't end, this final battle that we'll come back to, this sort of Armageddon, is what we think of mostly when we think of apocalypse. As Elizabeth rightly said, this is not the last part of it, is that it's not the end of everything. In fact, it's very much a beginning. It's the idea that finally, in this drama that's been happening for centuries of good versus evil, of the pronounced dualism, eventually good's got to win out ultimately, as in no more battles. And yes, so that's prefaced by the big final battle, but then God will come and usher in an eschatological new age. Eschatological is the fancy word for the end times. As in, at some point in this constant back and forth between good and evil, good will win out entirely, and evil will be defeated entirely. Eschatological, the end. So, what I want to do now then is pause and take a look at one example from antiquity that illustrates some of these themes that I'm talking about. And in particular, I've chosen the book of Revelation. Of course, some of you say, well, that's the obvious one, right? That's from the New Testament. And that's why I'm doing it, because also in sort of thinking forward, the book of Revelation, it's not necessarily the most popular at the time. There were several other apocalypses. But in the history of Christian and Jewish and Islamic thought, the book of Revelation has had a place of priority. That its themes and symbols have inspired later apocalyptic thought. And so any sort of discussion of, say, apocalyptic thought in medieval Europe or apocalyptic thought today, even in a secular post-apocalyptic kind of context, it would be hard-pressed to find an occasion where there's not at least some sort of theme or image that's not inspired by the book of Revelation. Very briefly, just to add some context in case you're not familiar with it, it's from the first, maybe late first, early second century CE. This is time of the Roman Empire. And it's written from the perspective of someone that's suffering under the rule, under persecution, and begins, I'll read the first verse, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. So it's also known as the Apocalypse or the revealing of John. It's presented as this letter from John to the churches in Asia Minor. And it's written in response, according to John, to the persecution that's coming to him and the other saints, and it's written about the kingdom of God. We also should note that it's very localized in its imagery. Some of those examples I'll come to later, but all of all the churches that it's written to are in Asia Minor in Turkey. I could talk forever about all the different little details that have inspired it. Maybe I'll say one. There's 7 churches. The 7th is the Church of Laodicea, which is known as the lukewarm church. Jesus tells John to tell them that they're not being very good. They're like lukewarm water, and no one wants to drink lukewarm water, so Jesus spits them out of his mouth. So it's a critique. It's a call to response. I'll come to that call to response in a second. You might say, okay, well, lukewarm, that's nice imagery, right? It comes from here. It's hard to see in this image, but Laodicea is in the Lycus River Valley, and a little hill that's right there, or maybe that hill. I can't ever remember which one. But here in the foreground are hot baths in Pamukkale. There were hot baths back then with nice minerals. You rest in really hot water, several degrees Celsius. I don't know Celsius, typical American. So there's hot baths there, and you can see maybe in the background here are mountains. And on top of the mountains, of course, are snow and fresh spring water. And so Laodicea was sort of in the dead center of this valley, nowhere near any other sort of source of water. And it was kind of the butt of a lot of jokes in the ancient world because the only water you could get in Laodicea was lukewarm. Because by the time it came down from the mountains, it had warmed up, the cold water. And by the time this hot, healthy spring water got to Laodicea, it had cooled down. So anyway, there's lots of inside jokes there. I could go on forever. But if I had to narrow down what Revelation is about, what this text is about, and what informs us about apocalyptic imagination, is this verse here in chapter 1, verse 19. Very short. This is the angel telling John, now write what you have seen, what is, and what is to take place after this. And hence my nerdy quote of Galadriel there from the Lord of the Rings. There's things that were, things that are, and things that have not yet come to pass. And that when we're talking about a revelation, yes, it is things that are going to take place after this. But notice again, here in the sort of original apocalypse, at least from a Christian perspective, it is also about, it's rooted in what has happened, what's currently happening to the church at the time, and then, of course, what will happen. When we dive into the book of Revelation, what we find is a complex set of images. Fantastic, crazy images, violent, destructive, war, pestilence, locusts with faces of humans and legs of horses, strange things. And what it teaches us, we couldn't go through all of these images. I'll talk about a couple of them in a second. But the one takeaway that it tells us is that what we have here in Revelation is an on paper, in a sense, acknowledgement that what we're dealing with apocalypse is a hidden kind of knowledge, a secret code. A secret code, not just to understand this text, this is sort of meta here, you need a code to understand this text, but you also need a code, a secret guide to understand the world. And what we find then in Revelation are several things that otherwise are unintelligible. Now, of course, these images, they stand out and they mean something to us today. We have depictions of angels and demons and battle, the war in heaven in chapter 12. We have Armageddon, the final battle, the war to end all wars that takes place in chapter 16. The Four Horsemen, I've got this nice manuscript here. The Four Horsemen are as a common theme there, with the white conqueror, the red horse of war, the black horse of judgment, and then, of course, the pale horse that is death. We also have the lake of fire, this sort of expression. And then in chapter 20, I'll come to that one again, the 1,000-year reign of peace. And also mixed in all of this are several numbers and symbols that, like I said, are otherwise unintelligible unless we have the key. And the key is a certain kind of knowledge that's only accessible to the insider community. And only accessible because John has told them, and John only knows because an angel has told them, and the angel only knows because God, via Jesus, told them to tell the angel. So there's a sort of game of telephone there. But it also illustrates that there's still a distance between the divine knowledge, God to Jesus to angel to John. That, yeah, something is likely to have been lost in translation, but it keeps that distance between divine and human. So we have things like this classic number, 666. Maybe some of you have heard of this before. And you think, okay, it's the sign of the devil. That's great. What does that really mean? Well, and for those that maybe are familiar with this, if you take Hebrew letters and you let them represent numbers, then if you spell the name Caesar Nero, that is the Emperor Nero from the 1st century, and you add up his letters in his name, then it equals 616. Wait, I thought you said 666. Well, if you put on an accusative ending, Caesar Neron, then it equals the noon there, the N letter is worth 50. So they strap that on there too to make it 666. But we do have some manuscripts that have 616. But the point of that is that what John is seeing are these wildly fantastic images where people are getting marked and beasts are fighting angels, and there's a dragon with 7 heads, and there's a great whore that's sitting on top of the dragon with 7 heads. And what John is being told is that while you may be seeing this heavenly sort of knowledge, it's really the code to understanding the earthly knowledge. So this number 666 is really Caesar Nero, who in the early Christian thought was the worst emperor ever, was the beginning of persecution against the Christians. So it really stands for any emperor. And when you saw this, when we talk about Rome, it's often depicted in Roman coins, like we have here, as a woman, a beautiful goddess, sitting on top of, it's hard to see, these 7 little hills. They say, no. What really it is that if you see the real Rome up in heaven, not the one that's here on earth, that's just a mimic of that, what you see is that she's actually not a beautiful goddess, she's a great whore. Yeah, it's not exactly a sexist-friendly book, but we can come to that in another discussion. And she's, of course, she's sitting on 7 heads of a dragon. And for those of you that know some Roman history, Rome is the city on 7 hills, as depicted here in this coin. So the point is that what Revelation here is offering is a counter-narrative, a counter-discourse. Counter to what? This is that second function of apocalypticism. First is explanation for suffering, explanation for why the world works the way it is. But this second function is one of resistance. What this knowledge is, this knowledge about the heavenly kingdom versus the earthly kingdom, is one that directly counters common knowledge. And common knowledge in that time was knowledge that was produced and spread by the Roman Empire. Yes, Roman Empire is evil and terrible for lots of reasons. For crucifying people, as you might know. For literally, very physically exerting their power, their military power, on the bodies of humans. I mean, what made them a great empire, great, and I don't necessarily mean in a good way, but great as in a powerful empire, was that they were able to exert that influence on the bodies and on the land. They were able to extract as many resources as possible without completely breaking all of these societies. Yeah, there were some revolts eventually. But in general, during their heyday, was that they were able to exert that power in a very physical way. But what an empire is not just someone that goes out like some sort of bully in a Darwin sense, and this is, I'm bigger and stronger, so I beat you up and take your stuff, and just expand that to an empire. That's part of it. But what an empire does, and that's the most powerful, is what Gramsci calls the hegemony, is it controls the way people think. You understand the world in a certain way, and it impresses that thought, that worldview, onto its subjects. And so what apocalypses do, what the apocalyptic imagination is a space, here a rhetorical, literary space, to counter that narrative. To say, no, Rome, you aren't the most powerful thing. No, when you are beating our bodies, it's actually for the glory of God somehow. It offers an alternative way of thinking. And it does it by, again, resorting to the idea that what's happening on earth is not really what's happening. It's just an echo, a reflection, a poor one at that, of what's happening on heaven. And in heaven, we see the real drama taking place. And eventually that will be resolved. And there's our Four Horsemen. Now, I'll take a brief pause here. We got a couple minutes. And talk about how Revelation is not the only apocalypse from this time period. There are several different writings that reflect this worldview. I'm just using one. I feel I actually had sort of the idea of at some point of just saying, I'm going to talk about Revelation, then I'm going to talk about the Apocalypse of Peter, but no, then I'm going to talk about 1st Enoch and 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, and talk about all these different texts that maybe you've never heard of. Or maybe you have. That's great if you have. You've been in my class. You have, I hope. And it would take forever. But what I thought was probably a little more efficient is to say Revelation's not the only one. It's the one we know the most because it made it into Christian canons. But it's certainly not it's not the only one. It's definitely not the earliest. One, we can think of something from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible, of Daniel 7 through 12 as an apocalypse. And there's others that are older and parallel. But what might be more efficient is to talk about generally what we find in these things, and it's a way of sort of orienting. Because this worldview, this idea of thinking about, hey, we think of the world differently than everyone else, again, hopefully there's some echoes of my friend back there, that we have a different way of understanding the world, and it's very much anti-Roman, at least in this case, or previously with Daniel, anti-Greek, is that it became a very popular worldview, and it became a very popular way of promoting this was to write these dramatic, what we call apocalypses, for lack of genre, but dramatic sort of revelations, prophecies. They're filled with heavenly journeys and or historical sketches explaining how the world works by either going to heaven and hell and looking at how they're made up, and thus it's reflected here, or sometimes by looking back, like that quote from Enoch I gave you earlier about how the world has worked according to a pattern, but we just didn't understand the pattern. So it's really not chaos, there's really a pattern. Along the way, we need a divine messenger, an angel, to explain these things, because again, we're getting access to a divine kind of knowledge that we otherwise can't understand. So even these special prophets like John and Daniel and Enoch and Ezra, even though they have this sort of these elevated status figures in the community, even though they get this special knowledge, they can't understand it without an angel to interpret it for them. In each of these apocalypses, then, they are focused not only on the past and not only on the distant future, but on the present. So we often get a historical review that maybe these are like the whole world cosmos historical view. This one often very short, political, like I said, the allusions to Rome, and an assumption, a description about the immediate future, an anticipation that things will change soon. And then finally, as you might expect, they often have a very eschatological outlook, as in these apocalypses, like Revelation, they don't end with Armageddon. They end with triumphalist, or they have a triumphalist movement. They end in triumph. The book of Revelation continues past the violence, past the destruction, past not only the counter discourse, but the overthrowing of the Roman world, at least in its Roman context, and offers something beyond, something after the apocalypse. And one passage in particular, and I'm mindful of the time, it's worth pausing at here because it will inspire quite a few other apocalyptic movements, is from Revelation 20, the first 3 verses. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and the great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and locked and sealed it over him, so that he would deceive the nations no more until the 1,000 years were ended. The third function of an apocalypse, we have explanation, we have resistance. The third function is resolution. They offer a resolution to things, a final explanation, if you will. Knowing that there's this sort of symbolic hidden kingdom behind everything that really explains that it's all well and good, but at the same day people are suffering, the people of God are suffering from this perspective. An apocalyptic outlook is kind of meaningless if the evil people are never going to be destroyed. So what an apocalyptic outlook offers and anticipates is a radical break with the present way things are. An establishment of a new heaven and a new earth. An age of justice that then, oddly enough, prefigures the final judgment. I left off the very last part of verse 3. It says after the 1,000 years were ended, and then it says, and Satan gets released for a little while. Don't really know why, but it's important to the sort of chronology, because after Satan gets let out for a little while, then we have the final triumphant return of Jesus, the Messiah, and the kingdom of God, and then things are settled. So this 1,000-year reign is a good way to transition to thinking about how the book of Revelation and these early apocalyptic imaginings have been interpreted in subsequent centuries. And feel free to wave me when I'm out of time. So I could, like I said, I could go through lots of different examples. So this brief passage in Revelation 20 about the 1,000-year reign gave rise to a concept intimately connected to the apocalyptic imagination, and that's known as the Millennial Myth, with millennial, of course, being inspired, the word millennium for 1,000. And it's the idea that God's kingdom would take over on earth before the ultimate, final, heavenly kingdom. And this idea was popular, and it seems to be what's happening in the book of Revelation and in some subsequent writings. But as we know, or we think we know, this 1,000-year reign, this sort of age of justice, didn't come anytime after the first century, I guess. I don't know. Maybe we're all been, can't but think of there's a philosopher that said maybe there's a sort of demon out there that's just convincing us that we all know what we know, but we actually don't. But anyway, assuming that there's not some demon convincing us that world history is entirely different, this never happened. And eventually, as we know, or we think we know, we have this guy named Constantine, right? Or so the myth goes, right? He saw this sign, and by this sign I conquer, and he Christianized the empire. It's not so neat and pretty, but I don't have time to get into it tonight. But ultimately, Christianity triumphed, right? Christianity became the religion of the empire. So how do we then explain, where does apocalypticism fit in? How do we explain the book of Revelation in the context of Rome being Christian, of the empire on earth being Christian? Well, to sort of simplify how it kind of works, basically we had this relatively smart fellow named Augustine, who thought Revelation was just a horrific book and it was kind of pointless, but nevertheless it was popular, and so he had to deal with it. And he said, no, what we've got now in Rome is the city on earth, and in heaven is the city of God. Maybe you've read his city of God. And he said what this kingdom, this millennial kingdom is not a spatial temporal one here on earth. It's a transcendent one that already exists. We are in the millennium right now. We just have to choose or realize, a little Platonic there in them, realize that we're participating in it. Well, some are and some aren't. Here on earth is a carnal kingdom, and yes, it's still a poor reflection of the eternal kingdom, but there's a transcendent one. This in turn gave rise to this idea that if we are part of this kingdom of God on earth, even if like the real one is still in heaven, transcendent, this gave rise to this idea that, shouldn't we still thought that this millennium should happen, and it sort of morphed Augustine a little bit and said, no, the millennium is still there, we just haven't achieved it yet. So it gave rise to what's called postmillennialism. That is, the return of Jesus doesn't usher in a new kingdom, but rather, at some point, we on earth will form this great society, this great just kingdom of God on earth, this millennium, and then Jesus will come and usher in the new age. So it's up to us. Either it's iterated either actively or passively. It's the so-called last emperor myth. And it's been quite a powerful idea in that we can create paradise here on earth. It inspired in part Germany in the 20th century. It's inspired in part quite a bit in American mythology and its colonialist efforts in the recent centuries. So still popular, but by far the most popular or maybe most interesting, and I'll end with this, is the premillennialists. And that's the idea that it's seen Revelation not as something that had to do with the first century, it did a little bit, but it's a guidebook for us today, and that the world is still getting worse. The forces of evil are still in charge, and things are going to continue to unravel, and we need to jump into this way of thinking that's resistant to the world, and expect Jesus to come soon to usher in a new millennium. So it leaves with, I won't go through the different examples, like Oneida Community, Heaven's Gate, and others, but we get some sort of, we'll end with this nice fancy illustration. We get some illustrations that charter out everything in the book of Revelation, also a little bit of inspiration from Daniel and other texts, and say each of those things, each of the things in that text is a symbol that we can use to then interpret our world today. Everything we see in our world today can be interpreted through that lens. And that informed the apocalyptic imagination. What this used to be fringe groups, and for some maybe it still is, but over the 20th century it became somewhat mainstream. This idea of thinking that the world and its cultural progress is an antithesis to God's kingdom, and therefore we should still expect the millennium. So the apocalyptic imagination is not a schematization of the future, at least not only. It's not just about this end of this world, but it's a discourse, a way of thinking, a way of speaking that provokes a response. It's a language of hope and comfort in the face of suffering, and evil, a language of resistance to the narrative of the world, a language of resolution, a language of solving the final problems of the world in one way or another. And with that, I will end, and hopefully we'll talk about how some of those problems were solved by way of video games. Thank you.
Yes, Seth, things will get worse. I just heard you saying at the beginning of your lecture that compared to previous centuries, if you look at them, well, things are actually getting better on much respects. Where does it come from? This fear that I think a lot of people share, maybe in different respects, but the fear that the world will end and that everything is going worse.
Yeah, that's a good question because, I mean, for some, in certain situations, things are going pretty poorly, so it makes sense. When we talked about the sort of beginnings of the apocalyptic thought, the sort of accepted knowledge among scholars is that this way of thinking and these texts grew up in a time of great distress, of great peril and persecution, and sort of, in some ways, sort of an exhausted like plea of like, come on, God, what's the deal? Like, why are things going so poorly? But as I began the lecture and started to toward the end, is that there are times where we're in power, so to speak. We're among the sort of normative group in charge, and yet we still have these fears. And what I think, and then when we talk about more, is that what the apocalyptic imagination does is just like for the ancient world, albeit in a different way, it allows a space for us to work out our anxieties. Mm-hmm. In that context, we might call them theological anxieties, although I don't like to sort of divide so strongly.
How does that work? You know, that it gives context to our anxieties, or it gives us room to work out our anxieties.
Yeah, well, so we worry about plagues, we worry about wars, and then one solution is not to sort of, one we could sort of dismiss them as sort of unfounded fantasies, and yet they persist, right? Even as much as we want to, every few weeks or years, there's some sort of new virus, apropos of what's going on right now, or something in the world that says, oh wait, like things could get bad really quickly. And so what this sort of apocalyptic imagination does is it allows for us to play out that fantasy in a way that for some suits us, is say, okay, this is what happens when it does, or if it does, and here's how we can resolve it. But as the comment I liked earlier is that sometimes what we find in these apocalyptic fantasies are quite pessimistic. And that that's also with another comment earlier, is that it's not about giving meaning to the suffering, it's simply just about surviving. But it's a space, it discursive space where we can work out, whichever way we go, this anxiety that we have.
Yes, so could it be that you just said we live in a time in which we have a lot of control on many things, and that those things we don't control, like viruses, like AI going rogue, or like climate change, these are they're getting onto us maybe even more than in previous ages where people were used to not being in control.
Yeah, it's a response to helplessness, indeed. And in sort of both contexts. One sort of theological answer is that God's in charge, and even though things really are terrible, sort of this idea that we are helpless, but don't worry, God's in charge. And now we're helpless, and what do we do, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is how it's not. I think it's helpful to think with the past to try to understand what's going on, because they're doing a similar thought exercise, but we have to consider the fact. So what's changed is not this divine scripted kind of apocalypse, but sort of a meaningless apocalypse. That's perhaps the most.
Why meaningless?
If I want to wander down the path of potential sadness and pessimism, that's what is most, right? Like God in charge. If you have that sort of mindset, and people do today, just like antiquity, that God's in charge. It doesn't matter how it happens necessarily. It could be natural disasters, or it could be a zombie apocalypse, but God did it. But for those that don't have this sort of notion, don't operate in a worldview that God's in charge, and and yet the apocalypse could still happen, viruses or nuclear war, then we're confronted with the meaningless, as in an end of the world that's not for any good reason. There's no divine plan. That's the anxiety I think that's the scariest for most people.
And there's no one going to help us out. We have to pull ourselves out of the morass.
So there's lots of different responses, lots of different ways of saying, we got ourselves into it, we can get ourselves out.
We can.
Well, some, right?
Yes.
That's the thing with thinking about apocalypse, is I've presented one small slice. Granted, maybe in a well-conditioned ancient world that we think we know about, and it inspired later thought, but it's gone all sorts of different directions. Like I don't want to say apocalypticists think that there's a solution, because many think no, the solution is that there is no solution. That at best you survive whatever the coming destruction is, and then it's about continuing that survival. But some think no, it's an opportunity to rebuild, that we can start anew. That you can't create for some millennialists, even in a theological context, you can't create the millennium until you destroy the old one. You can't create the kingdom of justice until you've destroyed the kingdom of evil, essentially, of injustice.
But if you look at this, happenings from a secular perspective, how can we find a solution if we don't have anyone, or we don't have like a third party involved who might help us out?
Yeah, well, I don't know how we find a solution. I mean, it depends on, there's one of the shifts that I at least have noticed is this transition to that we've created our own apocalypse. If we're the arbiters of our own destruction, then surely we can figure it out.
Yes.
That we can also create our own resolution.
To what extent is that different? Because you can say, we created our own apocalypse, and that's what you see in certain movies, maybe that you indeed this AI going rogue you refer to.
Yeah.
But if we go back to the early text, aren't we the one who essentially initiate our own doom as well, except it's brought about by God or
that's a good point, right? It depends a lot on one's theology, right? Is God this hands-on, like affecting everything, or maybe for some God's just the old dude in history that flicked the first domino, and then the rest is sort of we're just being tugged along, like that classic philosophical thing of there's a truck and pulling a dog to a leash. We have some little way to move about, but that truck's going one way or the other. But for us today, it's somewhat different. Humanity's involved, but I would say much more so.
Was the end of the world seen as a punishment by God, or was it just a logical consequence, or just a...
So it's punishment for the wicked ones. So this sort of transition, if we're thinking in a Jewish and early Christian context, there were good times and bad times, and if they were good times, that means God was blessing you, and if there were bad times, that means God was punishing you. But so this gets to, how did apocalypticism sort of develop, is that, so the logic goes, by about the 2nd century BCE, the Jewish people had been centuries since they had their own kingdom. They'd been under oppression by foreign rulers for centuries. How do you maintain a theology that puts your God on top, and yet you have been essentially slaves, at the very least subservient people for centuries? How do you reconcile that? Well, one, to say, it's on purpose. God, that sort of idea of God rewards those that are good and punishes those that are evil still applies, but it's part of a much larger plan that, it's about timing. Now, not about immediate restitution.
Yes, so the idea of punishment may be the same, because I think now also we think it's sort of a punishment, just not given to us by God, but we we give it upon ourselves, we put it upon ourselves.
Even when we think in a sort of non-theological or secular, if you will, context, we tend to think of these things as self-inflicted. I mean, not always though, right? I mean, we don't always think of disease as our fault, or... Well, I was going to say natural disasters until, So
we briefly talked about punishment. I was wondering, you mainly talked about the Abrahamic religions. So is there also apocalypse in different cultures?
Yeah, well, it depends on what you mean by apocalypse, but
Ah.
if the idea that this present world is coming to an end and something new will then follow, yeah, it's pretty prevalent. I'm not really an expert on all those, on various ways it's conceived, but it's not unique by any means to Jewish, Christian, or Islamic traditions.
So, okay, so maybe I'm going to ask you the question anyway, and if you're
And I'm
not-
going to deflect anyway.
Yeah, that's good. So okay, if it's not necessarily punishment, but it does recur in other religions, is it always this, well, pretty gloomy, doomy scenario, or could there also be like, okay, we're entering this new, more just age without all this seemingly necessary destruction?
Well, I don't know about without destruction, but sort of the positive spin on it, it's, I feel like, I know there's some myth out there, but it's sort of likened to a snake that is going in a circle and it sheds its skin, and the new skin is nicer and better, as in certain worlds, they're good at the beginning or good-ish, and then it gets worse, and then you shed off the old world and start anew, and with that cycle, you get slightly better each time. So there's an upward trajectory, whereas in the in most, as far as I know, most of Jewish and Christian apocalyptic, it's a downward trajectory, right? Like there are times of good where it seems like things are going well, but it's still a downward spiral, as in good comes up, but then it's that, but it's eventually getting worse and worse and worse. But then jumps up.
Oh, but I was wondering, so we kind of can see maybe a trend in how the apocalypse has been perceived throughout the ages. It also featured in your lectures. Okay, first we were might have been reference to Greece, then to Rome. What explains this? And if you look at more contemporary culture, what kind of do you perceive certain changes in how we, in a more secular society, perceive this apocalypse?
Yeah, so I think, for better or worse, the film is definitely worth watching because it brings in a couple of things. Obviously, some of the biblical themes. These things are called arcs. It's inspired by the sort of flood of Noah, which is very apocalyptic. Jesus in Matthew 24 talks about the coming apocalypse, and he calls it, nothing has been seen like this since the days of Noah. So in the early Jewish and Christian mindset, the days of Noah, the flood, is sort of the type, like the prototype of what the end of the world will be like. So I like the film for picking up on some of those themes. Like I can't see that movie without thinking of that. But I think to answer your question, one of the things that movie does to also connect with what Elizabeth brought up is that the story, the sort of hook of it, of one, it's a little bit about climate change that's in there, although it was sort of in its nascent acceptance in terms of mainstream, sadly, in 2012. But it also brings in something that I didn't talk about, but I could have, sort of only alluded to, and then it brings up this idea of class and society, and that's what that movie tries to think through, maybe not so eloquently, is this idea that this new world that will exist after the ark is supposedly a classless society. Like the idea is the lottery was supposed to work regardless of your income. Now we know that doesn't. Like that, if you follow the film, then certain wealthy people do it, but it's a critique of the social class system that we've got. So yeah, it's about the end of the world, but it's also about critiquing our society.
About current society.
Yeah, current society.
Nice.
Yeah.
So that is the reason for the apocalypse in this film?
Well, there's, if I remember, I haven't seen it in a while. I don't think that someone come out and said, we're all being punished because we know, there's wealth inequality and we stamp on the poor or something like that. I don't think that's there. But that's part of the narrative, the sort of moral narrative is we feel with the people that are getting left out of this because they don't have the money. And the wealthy people, clearly someone's been selling the spots on the boat when they're not supposed to. So we're thinking with those people that see oppression. And so part of the narrative of the movie is not just the coming apocalypse, but overcoming this class distinction, or at least calling it out and say, this is a problem with society.
Yes.
And this is sorry.
No? I was going to say that if it's true that the apocalypse has so many faces, can't it be that it's just like foundational myth in which people try to deal with human responsibility, with human failure, and with maybe the human tendency to exploit or even destroy the world and others.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think especially if we think of recent film and literature, that it's become, myth is a great word. I might say it was sort of like this rhetorical space to question those things. Because what better way to think about the problems in society than by to wipe it out and say, if we build a new one, what's new, what's different? Those that are tech scholars here will know that one way you can tell what someone really cares about is that when they are copying from something old, what do they leave in and what do they leave out? And it sort of really pinpoints what we think the issues are, what we find important, whether it be social structure, our like Terminator, or some other like the AI. Trying to think of the name of the movie. There's one where it's AI gets out of control. Westworld is another good one. I wasn't thinking of that one, but it sort of pinpoints this idea of unbridled advancements in technology. Just because we can create something, should we? That harks back to the Manhattan Project and the nuclear bomb, and this idea of, that we're creating our own.
Maybe if you can look at it that way, like an original myth, and I mean in the positive sense, then we don't have to think of all these images of the Four Horsemen and the beast with the 7 heads. And can they be historically true? Because no, of course they can't. So then is the story worthless? No, because maybe it's not real, but it's true in the sense of that it gives meaning to.
Well, I think you've answered your own question for me. Is that for me? I'm not searching for these stories. What validates them as stories is not because is not because some guy, whoever it was in the year 100, predicted these things and he got it all wrong. But what gives them meaning is that people for centuries have read them and saw them as significant.
Yes.
So, and what we do in the study of religion, right, is not. I'm not talking about God. I'm not talking about angels, demons. I'm not even talking about the end of the world. I'm talking about people that talk about God and the end of the world, and what they find meaningful.
Why are you?
Why?
No, I mean, why is this topic fascinating you?
Well, short stories. I'm a history nerd, and I like to read. So, and that's why I'm mostly occupy the space of antiquity, even if I want to understand the sort of ripple effect of how Revelation has been interpreted, say up to modern day. I'll leave it at that. I'll say the short story. Long story later.
So Horizon Zero Dawn. One of the lines that caught my ear was, "We have to find out why the world is ours no more."
Yeah. Well, first let me say that if they would have let me, I would have talked about this game for the whole hour. Because it brings up so many different things that we could talk about. Well, sorry, what did you ask?
Well, maybe what's the main thing you would want to talk about in regard to this?
Yeah, so one, it's a gripping story. You're following this post-apocalyptic scenario. It's a tribal culture. It sort of reflects a lot of tropes that we see in post-apocalyptic fiction. They usually go one way or the other. Some is that we've destroyed the world and now it's almost uninhabitable. Think Matrix, Book of Eli, Terminator kind of things. Or humanity has killed itself, and thankfully nature then is allowed to take over. And this is nice because it kind of does a little bit of both. It creates this sort of Edenic society, like this is in Denver, is where it's set, and out in the American West. But you see it's all covered in green. These buildings are covered in vegetation. But there's still that sort of threat of technology. I don't want to spoil the game too much for those that want to play it, but basically we still have these machines that were the end of society, and they're still around.
And so is humankind.
Yeah, and so is humankind. That's what you asked about having to know what happened. So us as viewers, and one of the things that I think is great about gaming the apocalypse, that was the slide I didn't quite get to, we're not just thinking with the apocalypse when we read text or we learn about these different groups, is gaming the apocalypse there's been studies on game theory, on video games, that it's a way to sort of immerse ourselves in the world, that we can be moral subjects in the apocalypse. We don't just follow the sort of trajectory of the narrative itself. We can sort of write our own narrative, and we can impact how the story ends, in a sense. And that's what I think is fascinating about it, is that when we think about the post-apocalypse, it's not just a sort of a imaginative space where we can then critique society. This has to do with, it brings up critiques of technology, unbridled technology, corporate culture, greed, again, not to give away too much, but basically like it's weapons systems that this guy's like selling the most of them, and he wants to just make them better and better. So he inserts an AI that's supposed to be self-replicating, and it can what sounds like a good thing is it uses biofuels, right? And that sounds nice in our native age of like, but it goes too far, and so eventually these machines can consume everything that's organic and self-replicate, and it kills everything.
Yeah.
So it's sort of this idea that we can play in that world. We can think about it, and we want to know what happened, as she says, to try to figure it out. Why do we want to know? We want to know what we did wrong. Like, that's sort of the irony, is that it's an imaginary world, but we want to know, what did humanity do back in this sort of revisionist history or potential history?
And it conquers the helplessness, right? So we just said that, if we now think about the apocalypse, then it's the end.
Yeah.
That's it. And it happens due to our own fault.
Yeah.
And we can't really solve it. And this video game, you get the chance, as you said, to intervene and to change things.
Well, to figure it out, but like you can't change it. It's already done, right? That's the post-apocalyptic is. So an apocalyptic sort of scenario, or is ideally is this, like in Revelation and others, it's the impending apocalypse. Can we change? In some cases, it's a call to response that either extends it or solves it. But in the post-apocalyptic, it's already happened, and now we have to sort of resolve things in that scenario. And so here, it's finding out what happened. For us, there's sort of two narratives going on. Us as players to say, okay, maybe I don't want to do this in the world. Like, if you don't take it so seriously and you just go around and kill a bunch of machines, that's fine. But at least it makes me think this way of what's wrong with society. It points these things out, whether I want to see them or not.
At the same time, if you look at these post-apocalyptic scenarios, and when we go back to your lecture, what seems to be missing in many of these movies and games is this triumphalist movement. I mean, after the apocalypse, I haven't seen this 1,000 years of happiness. It's always this pretty grim setting where we seem to have to deal with each other, but it's always this dog-eat-dog world. Yeah,
you're right. Whenever we see it in movies like Terminator or Book of Eli, like I've brought up, or even ones that end with a happy ending, it's sort of a localized happy ending. It didn't solve the world's problems. And I don't think it's meant to, and I think it would not be really well received if it did, because the anxieties are still there. At the end of the day, what it's doing is revealing, in a sense, by pointing it out in a scenario where that's all we can think about. And if it has an objective, the author or the filmmaker or the what have you has this sort of objective of response, then that's great, of us thinking about pollution or corporate greed, whatever. But it points it out and says, okay, now what? But it's not offering a sort of panacea to the apocalypse. There's no final kind of resolution to the...
No, but it could be a way to raise awareness about certain doomsday some people foresee.
Yeah, so that's what I said. That's what I think is the most alluring, at least to me, is that it's gripping, it's violent, maybe problematically so we could go down that route. But these apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic scenarios are ways of creating imaginary worlds that allow us to think about stuff that's happening in our world, much like fantasy literature does as well. That it's not safe to think about it in this world, although we have this sort of revisionist history type things like Watchmen and stuff that are a little different. But it's a sort of a safe rhetorical way to think about. No one wants the nuclear Holocaust to happen, but what if it did? Then what do we do? Right? It's a place to think that through.